سبيل مريح كان هدايا صاحي كي تستريح وغص الدعاء. I was born in Germany, and when Hitler came to power, I was 8 years old. And my parents very quickly realized that they needed to leave Germany, and they were willing to go anywhere in the world and do anything just to get out. But there was one country they were not willing to go to, and that was Palestine. And why? Because they were anti-Zionist. And as a young child, I didn't totally understand what Zionism or anti-Zionism is. I remember telling my grandmother, Grandma, I'm an anti-Zionist. She said, shh, don't say that. And I said, but Mommy and Daddy are anti-Zionists too. She said, don't say that. And I was a bit confused by that, but I let it go. And the saying in the village where I come from, which is Kippenheim, which is in the Black Forest, among the Jewish community, we were considered different. My maiden name was Wachenheimer, and the saying was, the Wachenheimers are different. And my parents were not really an integral part of the Jewish community there. My parents were more worldly, shall we say, and not as narrowly focused as the community was there. My first experience under the Hitler regime was just 2 months after they came to power. There was, on Saturday, April 1st, 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses all over Germany. And my father and his younger brother had a business that my great-grandfather started in 1857. And there was a Nazi standing in front of our store and the other Jewish stores. The next thing that really happened was in 1935. I had been attending a local grade school until then, but my parents decided that I should go to a neighboring school where the educational level was somewhat higher. And I went with my father to be enrolled. And the director of the school said, I'm sorry, but Hedy can't come to school here because you're Jewish. And my father didn't say a word, but he pointed to a pin, I guess, that he wore in the lapel of his jacket. And the principal said, oh, I didn't know you are a wounded veteran of World War I. In that case, Hedy can come to school here. And in the grade school, I never had any problems. When I first started in that second school, there were no problems. But by the second year, my classmates no longer talked to me, or if they did, they called me a dirty Jew and some other such words. Recess was perhaps the worst time of the day, because nobody played with me and nobody talked to me. And I also had the great misfortune. The last 2.5 years in that school, I had a math teacher who was an SS man. The SS were the Nazi elite, the stormtroopers. And he came to class almost daily in his black SS uniform, knee-high black boots, and his right boot he had a revolver. And when he asked me questions, he sometimes put his hand on the revolver, or at other times actually pointed it at me. And I was so afraid of this man and what he might do that no learning took place. And even today, figuring out simple arithmetic problem is a real problem for me. I'm haunted by this man. November 9th and November 10th was the first major, 1938, was the first major persecution of Jews in Germany and Austria. And on that day, I was unceremoniously kicked out of school by the principal, who said to me, "Get out, you dirty Jew." When I came home, our home had been vandalized. I found my mother at my aunt's home and learned that about 10 minutes after I left for school, my father was arrested, as were all the other men in the village, and in fact in Germany. And he was sent to the concentration camp Dachau, but we didn't know about for 2 weeks where he was or if he was even alive. And when he returned, he was no longer the father I knew. He was an old, sick, very, very, very sick man. But when he recovered somewhat, the efforts to leave Germany were resumed, and I was fortunate to be able to leave Germany on May 18, 1939, on a children's transport or kinder transport to England. And England took in almost 10,000, mostly Jewish children, in the 9 months preceding World War II, and would have taken more except the war broke out. I remained in written contact with my parents. I was placed with a foster family. And when the war broke out, you could no longer correspond directly, but you could send 25-word messages through the Red Cross. And that's how my parents and I stayed in touch. And then on October 22nd, 1940, all the Jews from that section of Germany where I come from were deported to a camp in what was then Vichy, France. Vichy, France collaborated with the Nazis, and there were several different camps in Vichy, France. It was perhaps an aberration of the war, but my parents were able to correspond directly with me. They could write only 1 page per person per week. I could write as much and as often as I wanted to. My parents never ever told me of the horrendous conditions there. That I only found out much later. And on August 9th, 1942, my father wrote to me, and by that time he was in a different camp than my mother, that tomorrow I'm going to be deported to an unknown destination, and it may be a long time before you hear from me again. And that was the last communication from my father. I then received a letter from my mother dated September 11th, 1942, in which she said essentially the same thing, hoping to meet my father somewhere and saying, and then we will carry our lot, no matter how difficult it will be, with dignity and with courage. And then there was one more postcard from my mother dated September 4th, 1942, and written in real shaky handwriting, saying she's traveling to the East and saying a final goodbye to me. What I didn't know then, that if you travel to the East in September 1942, you were probably traveling to Poland, to an extermination camp, and to your death. And both my parents had written, it may be a long time before you hear from us again. And how long is a long time? Is it a week, a year, 10 years? And since I wanted so very much to be reunited with my parents, I kept on saying, a long time isn't over yet, and I have to wait some more. And then in 1956, I received 2 letters from a French organization telling me that both my parents had been deported to the concentration camp Auschwitz. And I knew a lot about Auschwitz at that time, and I knew some people survived. So I still hoped I would meet my parents somewhere. And then in September 1980, I went back to Europe to visit the various camps where my parents were. And when I was in Auschwitz, and I stood on the place where the cattle cars arrived, and where the people had to get off, and the infamous Dr. Mengele made a decision as to who will go directly to the gas chamber or who will be allowed to live a little while longer while performing difficult work. When I stood on that place in September 1980, I finally accepted there's no way that my parents survived or other family members. After the war was over in May 1945, shortly thereafter, I returned to Germany to work for the American government, first for the U.S. Civil Censorship Division, censoring incoming and outgoing German mail. I had a contract for 1 year, And then after that, I went to Nuremberg, where the international trial of Nazi criminals took place. But the American government had decided that when that trial is over, they will conduct 12 more trials in the same Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. And I was hired. I applied and I was hired. My work was, or my title was research analyst. And I was assigned to the case of the Nazi doctors who performed medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. And most of my work actually was done in a former Nazi document center in Berlin. And my job was to look for the documentary evidence to be used by the prosecution in the trial of the Nazi doctors. And I worked there until March of 1948, and then returned briefly to England and came to this country in May 1948. It was about the same time that Israel became a state. And I had some conflicting thoughts about it. On one hand, I was glad that there was a place for survivors to go to because maybe they couldn't go back or chose not to go back where they came from. But on the other hand, I remembered my parents' anti-Zionism, and I was afraid that somewhere down the road, no good would come of this. What that might be, I couldn't possibly imagine. But I was new in this country, new experiences, and so Israel and Palestine were on the back burner of my interest. I became involved in discrimination again as it pertains to African Americans, and it was not until 1982 that I got a wake-up call about what is happening in Israel-Palestine. I learned that there were two massacres in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, and I needed to find out, what was this all about? Who was responsible? Who was adversely affected by it? And what happened between 1948 and 1982 when I paid little or no attention to this part of the world? And as I learned more and became increasingly more disturbed by the policies and practices of the Israeli government vis-a-vis the Palestinian people and their land, I began to speak out and speak out publicly. And it was not until the end of 2003 that I went to the Israeli-occupied West Bank for the first time. I've been there 5 times, all told. I've also made 5 attempts to go to Gaza, each of them for a variety of reasons. 2006, I knew some of the people prior to this happening. I knew some of the people already, and that's how I got involved in this. And in 2008 was the first attempt to go from Cyprus to Gaza, and I had fully intended to participate in that. But we were in Cyprus for at least 2 or 3 weeks because there were all kinds of problems, difficulties that needed to be worked out before we were really ready to go. And it was extremely hot. It was 125 degrees every day with matching humidity and no air conditioning. Mm-hmm. And I got sick because of the heat, and I fainted. And it was a short period that I fainted. And the people that I was going to travel with were very concerned about my health, and much more concerned than was necessary. But I decided we had so many concerns. What is Israel going to do? Are we going to make it to Gaza? And I did not want to add another level of concern to the people who were going, and so I chose not to go. I can't undo what happened, so I didn't get to go. there were two rickety boats, and they made it all the way to Gaza. The Israelis did not stop them. They threatened, before they left, they threatened they were going to torpedo us, they were going to do all kinds of things. But they did not do anything, and the two boats actually went. And that must have been a wonderful experience, not only for the people in Gaza, who turned out I think everybody in Gaza was there to welcome the two boats, as well as for the people who were on the boats. Mm-hmm. And they were internationals, they were Americans, they were from different countries. Right. And there were subsequent attempts to go to Gaza. The last attempt was in 2010 via Egypt. And Mubarak, who was then still in power, refused to let us go. And we negotiated and we tried everything we could. I went on a short hunger strike, hoping to convince Mubarak to let us go. And then finally, Madame Mubarak decided to let 100 of us go. Mm-hmm. And the then foreign minister was very angry with her and called the rest of us hooligans. Mm-hmm. And I was among the 100 who could go. Mm-hmm. And it was a very, very difficult decision for me, because here was the one and only maybe opportunity for me to get into Gaza. But I decided that if I do go, I will be complicit with Mubarak, I will be complicit with the American government. And on the short term, it will be satisfying, but in the long term, I'm going to have to live with that decision. And so I chose not to go. Mm-hmm. There's a siege of Gaza by the Israelis. The Israelis control the land, the sea, and the air. And it was to try and break that siege and make it possible for boats to get into Gaza. And right now there is an effort underway to have a boat, the Gaza Ark, which is being built, right? Or it's not being built, it's a fishing boat that is being renovated so that it's seaworthy and will leave Gaza with goods that are either grown or made in Gaza and take them to other countries. Mm-hmm. Hopefully the Israelis will not interfere, but knowing them, mm-hmm. I don't know that this boat's going to go very far. Mm-hmm. But it is another attempt to break that siege. We took some aid with us, but it was merely a token. Right. The purpose was to stand with the people in Gaza and support them in their efforts to be able to live like the rest of the world is living. And I think the psychological support to the Gazan people is very important. Mm-hmm. And to tell the world, there's what Israel is doing. The world looks the other way. They don't want to know. Mm-hmm. They do know, but they don't want to know. And they need to know. And maybe when you do something like this, some people will pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And maybe put pressure on Israel to not break humanitarian laws. Mm-hmm. I'd like to address the last part of your question first. What gave me hope is the resilience of the Palestinian people. Despite all the adverse living conditions, they're an amazing people. There still is hope that someday we will be free. And that's, after years and years of occupation, is just an amazing trait. I left together with 3 other women from St. Louis to go to the West Bank. And when and none of us had ever been to the West Bank before. The three others were Christians. I was the only Jewish person. And we aligned ourselves with the International Solidarity Movement, which is a Palestinian movement, and underwent their rigorous nonviolent resistance training. And you have to make a commitment to ISM that no matter whom you encounter, no matter what situation you encounter, you will remain nonviolent. If you cannot make that commitment, you cannot participate in their activities. And we all made that commitment. And after our training, our first stop was in Jayush, which is a village northwest of Jerusalem. It's a very old community. Some of the homes are built on top of old Roman ruins. And at that time, when we were there, the wall did not yet exist. I don't think it's really changed very much. It's become much more ingrained. You know, the Palestinians are the terrorists and the Israelis are the ones who are being attacked. Mm-hmm. And it's the reverse. Mm-hmm. It's the Palestinians who are the victims, mm-hmm. and the Israelis are the perpetrators. Right. And in some ways, I guess they are the victims too, mm-hmm. because when you are a perpetrator, you're going to have to live with what you've done. Right. And so sometimes I see a tiny little change, mm-hmm. but there needs to be humongous changes in order for peace to be in this part of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a dreadful situation. There isn't a day that passes that a home is destroyed. Why? Because they added a room to it, and they've applied for permission and never got the permission. But, you know, the family size increased and they need to expand. There isn't a day that a Palestinian isn't killed, whether that be a child or an adult. There isn't a day that movement is restrained. If you want to go from one village to the next, you can't because they're black checkpoints. Mm-hmm. Life just isn't normal as it should be. For the people in Gaza, for instance, you know, some Israeli official decided that we will give them only enough food so they won't starve, but not enough to really sustain a healthy life. Life in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza is just extremely difficult. When you go to bed at night, you don't know if you're going to be alive the next morning. If an Israeli soldier isn't going, or soldiers are not going to break into your home in the middle of the night and arrest a family member. And resistance by the Palestinians is perfectly legal. It's perfectly morally right on every level that you want to measure it. And, you know, the economy of the Palestinian people has been destroyed. Health issues are another huge problem because there's not enough medicine or medical equipment that can come in, or replacement of machines that have broken down. You know, people that are on, let's say, on dialysis, they need to be on that machine for a certain number of hours. Well, what happens, as it happens in Gaza all the time, the power is shut off. Mm-hmm. The generators can't come in anymore. I mean, at this point, Gaza is, it's been said before, it's an open-air prison. It's become even more of a prison since the change in government in Egypt because there was still the possibility, at least through Gaza, to come in, or maybe through some of the tunnels that were built, because there was not open borders. But Israel closes the borders by land, by sea, and now Egypt is closing the Rafah, opening the Rafah exit or entry. I mean, the goal, I guess, of the Israelis is to make life so miserable for Palestinians that they will somehow just leave and go away, and that Israel can become the greater Israel, like from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River or beyond to the Euphrates or wherever.
قد كان بالسقم دهرا طريق
For Christians, if the Israelis don't really make any difference or see any difference between Christians and Muslim or Palestinians. They're Palestinians, and so they're all, terrorists. For the Jewish people in Israel, I think they don't want to know, and if they do know, they turn their heads and say, and it's a lovely day today, and life is fine. They're told you cannot go to the West Bank, and a lot of them adhere to that, even though the West Bank for some of them is just around the corner. But they do not go there. They don't know what's happening there. They don't want to know what's happening there. Now, this doesn't apply to every single Israeli. There are Israeli people who are involved in struggling against Israeli policies and practices, and are involved in trying to bring peace to this area. Well, it takes many of us to do many different things. There isn't one single thing that will bring peace. With all of us working on it and trying to wake up our government to what is really happening and not be afraid. Our representatives, or some of them, most of them, are afraid that if they do not yield to what Israel wants, that they're anti-Semites. And they're not. It's by, if they do nothing, then they really are not in tune with what it takes to live in a civilized, peaceful way.
Okay. If there's somebody who listens to this and then they feel motivated to get involved and do something, what advice would you have for them in order to get involved, in order to make a difference on this cause?
You mean locally or
Maybe you can do both. Maybe first off locally, let's say in St. Louis, what can they do? Then also beyond nationally.
All right, well, for instance, here in St. Louis, there's the Palestine Solidarity Committee, and we meet once a month in the World Community Center at 438 North Skinker. We meet on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. And we've done a lot of activities. I guess our biggest feather in the cap was this past year. There was a French company by the name of Veolia, which was trying to get a contract with the city as far as our water company is concerned. And the mayor was all gung-ho to work with Veolia. And we found out about it and started to work against this in conjunction with other local groups. And at some point, Veolia said, it's not worth it, and they pulled out.
And what about
in Israel, there are several organizations that are working on different issues. For instance, there's a group called Mahsom Watch. It's women that go to the checkpoints and observe what is going on there and try to be helpful. there is another group that I just found out about called Sohot, and they try to work on Israeli-Palestinian relations and through dialogue, through meeting each other. There's another group, I can't think of its name right now, where both the Palestinians and the Israelis have lost family members, and they are working together to not hate each other. There are soldiers who have realized what they have done, and there's an organization of soldiers who are trying to work with other young people, because when they're 18 they have to join the army, and trying to work with them so that they don't see there is another way of living and not joining the army, or supporting those who then resist going into the army. They're jailed for a period of 30 days. When they come out, they're asked, "Are you ready to join now?" And they say no. They go back to jail for another 30 days. And so they work with these young people.
Okay.
And all of us together, someday, I'm an eternal optimist, someday we will change matters, and Palestine will be free.
Sure.
If you read the regular media or listen to TV or radio, you get a very slanted kind of a viewpoint of what's happening there. And so there is alternative media, and I think we're in the period of the computer, and there's all kinds of information that you can get on the internet to get another viewpoint, and then you can decide. You see two different viewpoints. You read the regular media, and you read the alternative media, and then you can decide for yourself what you think is really happening and what you want to do. And I think if you do not participate in trying to free the Palestinian people, you become almost as complicit as the perpetrators. So being a bystander and doing nothing and saying, well, it's over there, it's too far away, I don't know, my government, I don't understand what my government is doing, but it's all too complex. If you're saying that, you're complicit in the pain and the suffering. A lot of the things that go on in Palestine that under Israeli jurisdiction are very weird and don't make sense.
That's a great example.
And if you think you know the rules today, tomorrow they're different.
Okay, well, I guess
That's
that's all.
everything.
Yeah. Thank you so
Wait,
much.
before we conclude, is there anything you want to say, or before we conclude, or a final message for the audience?
It's the shortest interview as compared to the one I talked about for 10 hours in Germany.
Of course. No, we try to keep
And
it.
that was as I want to share this with you. This part of that interview was on April 10th. And April 10th was the anniversary of Deir Yassin which was a village in Palestine that was destroyed on April 10th, 1948, shortly before Israel became a state, was destroyed by the future Israeli government, by the Stern gang, which was a terrorist gang. And they killed over 100 people, and many of them fled. And so there was an anniversary commemoration in Deir Yassin on April 10th, and via Skype, I was able to talk to the people in Deir Yassin, which was very exciting.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate, and I learned a lot as well.
الخفي الصريح يا ساعة الفضاء